Welcome back to the Campaign with Ernie Powell. Our next guest is Gary Passmore, and Gary's an old friend from Sacramento and a good friend and one of the most effective lobbyists I've ever met for social justice. He's vice president of the Congress of California Seniors. He's been with the Congress of California Seniors since December of 2002. He oversees the CCS, or Congress of California Seniors Sacramento office, where he's head of the advocacy program in the state legislature. He also coordinates advocacy work with many other groups and serves on coalitions on health care, long-term care, affordable housing, and nursing home reform. Before joining CCS, Gary headed a public affairs consulting firm for 10 years, and he also served way back when as chief of staff to the governor of Missouri and has been a state budget director of Missouri before that. He's worked on state budget issues also in both Illinois and North Carolina. He's one of the most educated and hardworking people I know in Sacramento. Gary Passmore, welcome to the Campaign with Ernie Powell.
Hey, Ernie, how are you this afternoon?
I'm good.
And hello to all your listeners.
Yeah, we're dying of the heat down here. Is it hot in Sacramento?
No, it's not. Well, it is warming up, but it has actually cooled off in the last couple of days, and it's beautiful for anybody that wants to come up. I'm sure there are lots of vacant hotel rooms.
Okay. Well, I think where I want to start is to talk sort of in a global way with you about the role of state government in providing social services for the most vulnerable members of our most vulnerable people in California. And
Sure.
Because most of the time I think folks just think that there's Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and they see them as federal programs. But the fact is that California, in the past at least, has had I think a pretty proud tradition of helping particularly older Californians age with dignity. So
I would agree. I'd agree with that assessment, Ernie, and things are different than they were 10 years ago.
Right. So take us back to the kinds of programs that California has done, and then let's talk about the terrible destruction that took place in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008 period with Schwarzenegger as governor during the budget deficit,
Sure.
And then changes. So let's start first with what the state typically has done as a state that cares about older people and aging with dignity.
Well, I can give you a number of examples. The first is that California was really an incubator for a lot of reforms in services and programs for aging that have been adopted by most other states. We were the first state to develop a home-based setting for caregiving so that people weren't forced to go into nursing homes. The vast majority of people, especially today, don't want to be locked up in an institution in order to get basic, care and services. California has far and away still the largest home care program in the United States. The next largest is probably New York State, and it's maybe a third of the size of ours. Another area where we kind of pursued the same goals but in a very different way, and that is that we created a network of community-based centers where people could go and basically get nursing services, things like blood pressure checks, diabetes, blood sugar checks, get their medications monitored, get basic rehab if they, say, had a stroke, where people with dementia were cared for. And those programs, again, were unique. They have been models nationally, and they have been cut back severely in the last several years. We've lost at least 20 to maybe 25% of our capacity, even though we've had quite an increase in the number of seniors.
So let me parse those two out, because this is the track record in terms of creating ways, and I want to use the term aging with dignity for this state.
Yeah, and in both cases that was the goal.
Right. So let's talk about home care for a minute. So nobody wants to go into a nursing home. I mean, for a number of reasons. Number one, nursing home is not your home.
That's correct.
People as they age want to stay in their neighborhood. They want to keep knowing their neighbors.
I would say this also, Ernie, though. There is a small number of people with advanced Alzheimer's or dementia that literally need, in order to protect themselves, probably need to be in an institutional setting, maybe not in a traditional nursing home, but certainly in a situation in which they're monitored 24 hours a day. And that's difficult to do in a home care setting.
Absolutely.
But most people, you're absolutely spot on. Most people want to be in their communities and preferably in their homes.
And so what the state of California did many years ago, and correct me, I think it actually happened during when Reagan was governor. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Is they started...
began then, and ironically, Jerry Brown provided much of the growth for it early on in his first stint as governor.
So what happens if you reach a certain level of disability, whether you're old or you're not old, you can, if you qualify, you can then ask for and receive as much as 30 to 40 hours of assistance with a person who comes into your home and helps you. It's called in-home supportive services. And
it's actually more hours than that. It's about 270 hours per month.
Okay.
So if you divide that by about 4.2 weeks, it turns out to be like about 65 or so hours per week. And people who are seriously disabled, profoundly disabled, can qualify for more, on an exception basis.
And so what happened was California did this, it thrived, it worked, and it also, it might not correct, by having people stay at home and get this kind of care, number one, it made them happier as recipients of care, and number two, it saved the state enormous amounts of money because it's a lot less expensive than putting them into a nursing home. Am I right about that?
It costs less than 1/3 of the cost of being in a nursing home.
Okay, and the second part that you talked about a minute ago, if I could just, we want to get the big picture, the whole picture here, is what you called a network of community-based services.
Yes.
And that's through what we all know as area agencies on aging, but it's
adult
also
day health care centers.
And it's also through, and I was going to say the same words, the adult day health care centers. And those were ingenious and creative moves on the part of the people of California. Am I correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And they, too, were aimed at people who otherwise might be institutionalized.
Mm-hmm.
And so they, too, not only provided care in the setting that people wanted it and provided high-quality care,
right,
they also saved the taxpayers' dollars.
Now, here comes a few years ago when we started to see a number of those budgets and those programs challenged, and particularly during the Schwarzenegger era, but also afterwards. Can you talk?
There are two things to understand.
Okay.
First of all, early on in former Governor Gray Davis's administration,
mm-hmm.
the state had some very prosperous years, and by state, the people worked, and they generated additional tax dollars that go to programs in Sacramento, and there were significant increases in those tax dollars. And part of those taxes involved an increase in the cost of a license for an automobile, essentially, and generated on the order of $12 billion in state revenues. When Arnold Schwarzenegger came into office, he ran on one of his planks was a commitment to get rid of that tax because it was an unpopular tax if you owned a $70,000 Range Rover or Maserati. And so the people that he often talked to complained about that tax.
Yeah, I hated paying it for my two Maseratis. I'll tell you that right now.
Well, I only own one, and so I didn't squawk quite as loud. The point is, he talked the legislature into eliminating it because he had one good year of revenues, and it looked like we could survive if we held our belts tight and eliminate it. And it was immediately after that that the bottom fell out of the economy nationally, and really worse here in California than in most places, because so much of our economy was tied to housing construction, housing sales. Mm-hmm. And the state's overall revenues collapsed. So not only did we experience the same cutbacks in the recent massive recession, we also sort of cut off our left hand by reducing our revenues at the same time. And the state lost almost one-third of its revenues to support public programs.
And they aimed, but there were more choices than the choices they made. And they aimed those cuts toward the most vulnerable. And can you tell us what happened?
Well, what's happened, as I mentioned, with the adult day health care program, we've lost about 24% of the population because we no longer have centers there. We have lost, fundamental services in the state's health care program that we share the cost of with the federal government. You mentioned that most people think of Medicaid as a federal program. It's matched dollar for dollar by state revenues. And in order to make dollars go further, they, for adults, eliminated all dental care. Dental care is fundamental to good health care. They eliminated eyeglasses. Eyeglasses aren't covered under federal Medicare. They eliminated things like hearing aids, diabetes supplies, incontinence supplies for people that are bedridden and can't toilet. So, I mean, there were some really horrible cuts. They tried and succeeded in making cuts in our in-home supportive services program we talked about a moment ago. We froze and then cut back every dollar that the federal government would allow us to cut in something called the SSI program, which is essentially a program that helps people live who do not qualify for Social Security. A lot of people with disabilities, but you'd be surprised how many older people age like school teachers that never paid into Social Security and then discover that they're quite poor when they get old.
So that I could drive and I forgot, I actually don't have 2 Maseratis, I have 4 Maseratis. So I can drive my 4 Maseratis. I got my taxes cut, and what happened is that the elder down the street who needs incontinence care and needs help with their teeth can't get that help. Is that a good way to say it?
That's exactly it. I mean, it's just a plain old dollar-for-dollar trade, and in all fairness, public school programs got whacked, teachers got laid off, they got rid of many of the optional programs, college tuitions were increased dramatically, and state workers were furloughed. They had to show up for work without pay, or they didn't show up for work, so the overall functioning of state government suffered enormously. And I will say this, Governor Schwarzenegger got the legislature to agree to the idea of selling some state bonds, economic recovery bonds, to get us through the very worst year and a half or two. It didn't help. We had to do all of these cuts anyway. But what we're left with then is the same thing that would happen if a family lost their job and decided to continue living using their Visa card.
I see.
The bill has come due.
Okay.
And we owe billions and billions of dollars that we essentially put on a credit card at the state level so that we could survive with cuts that weren't any deeper.
All right, and my co-host today, I want to introduce you to him, is Carl Kozlowski, and he has a question. Carl?
I was wondering, it seems that at least what we hear in the mainstream media, and let's see, also in Atlantic Magazine did a big profile, and Rolling Stone, of how Jerry Brown has allegedly turned a lot of things around with the state deficit, and then we hear that at least in terms of education, that he has been restoring some of the funding. Like that was a promise that he made in exchange for these draconian cuts. Has there been any sort of similar upturn or hope for an upturn on these other fronts aside from education?
I mean, I think the quick answer to your question, Carl,